The current news and social media focus on Chinese Australians as little more than victims of racism needs to change. Now, if you're as addicted to news and social media as much as I am, it's hard to have missed the rise in media coverage of racist abuse directed towards Chinese Australians. Now, I say media coverage because I personally have not experienced this in a long time. I did plenty of times when I was younger, but not in some decades. And I would say that's also been the case for most of my Chinese friends and family. But while I want to say a COVID-driven spike in racism against Asians in Australia is nonsense because I know of so few attacks personally, I can't. I suspect that many of the samples of research conducted by progressive organisations that are quoted in media reports about a supposed spike in racism towards Asians are skewed towards acquaintances of those progressives. But I can't totally write off the reports, because if you look at the actual raw numbers of Asian Australians who have reported suffering racial abuse, including Chinese, who say they've been racially abused in the last 10 months, it's in the hundreds, if not more. And that's not acceptable, and it can be fixed. But the fix is not progressive or conservative outlets, for that matter, publishing only articles about racist attacks when it comes to Asian Australians. This one-dimensional coverage is something I know that many other minority groups complain about, that journalists always just make them look like helpless victims or ungrateful complainers, and that is just not what most Australians respond to. So stories profiling Chinese Australians who have been racially abused are important. But if they are the only type of story about us, they are going to make us fearful and increasingly hostile towards other groups. And I've seen this myself in some Chinese Facebook groups, both here and in the US, where the problem is certainly much more severe when it comes to violence against Asian Americans. And that leads nowhere good. What we need is more media coverage and representation of the majority of Chinese Australians. We have so many success stories and happy migrants, both famous and in the ordinary walks of life. Newsrooms need to speak to more of those migrants, those who love their country of heritage, but also Australia, those who love and are loved by our non-Chinese neighbours, families, friends and colleagues. But we so rarely get that coverage. Conservative newsrooms still seem wary, or worse, of including Chinese Aussies in their everyday coverage because they know so few. Progressive journalists, as I mentioned, are preoccupied with calling out racists or advocating for unpopular policies such as targets or quotas, and neither is helpful to what is Australia's largest non-white ethnic group. So Chinese Australians are just waiting for newsrooms and activists who will truly understand them. Caleb, I'd love to know your thoughts. Are you surprised that there aren't more Asian or Chinese heritage commentators in media, including the centre to right side of things?
Look, I tend to think that Asian migrants are probably too smart to go into media. I mean, I don't know what we're doing here. We've pulled the short straw. Clearly, we don't make a lot of money, and we're sitting around doing this kind of thing. But I agree with you. I mean, Australia is a very diverse country, and there ought to be representation of the people who live in it. And I think you're right that often what we get is a very divisive look at racial politics. And this is often whipped up, as you note, by the left, who want to portray, for whatever reason, that Australia is a fundamentally racist country, and that the interactions, I mean, if you looked at some sections of the media, you would, not be forgiven. You could be forgiven, for thinking that the majority of interactions that migrants and other people, non-white people, have in this country are racist. And that is simply not true. I do not know what exactly the left is trying to do when it does that. It simply sows the seeds of division, which ultimately makes the situation worse. Quite often I think it is because the extremes of debates are able to get hold of it, and they are able to get airtime because, of course, they are more extreme, so they're more polarising, so they're more interesting. But that's not borne out in reality. The people I went to school with, which wasn't all that long ago, were from various backgrounds, from all over the world, and I cannot say that I can't say that I've ever witnessed an instance of racism in the schoolyard, because that's just not how people are anymore. People don't grow up like that anymore. There are outliers, of course, but to portray it as though there is this rising racism against Chinese, Australians or any other group, I think is wrong and ultimately bad for the nation, because it sows the seeds of division.
Yeah, well, look, Caleb, I mean, well, first of all, in terms of pointing out that journalists, for some reason, seem to indulge in a more volatile, or media commentators for that matter, indulge in a more volatile and less income-earning type of area. Look, you're certainly right. I mean, I'm Asian Australian, obviously. I started off heading down the legal career. For some bizarre reason, I decided to become a journalist.
You should have stuck with it, mate.
I've been through at least 2 rounds of redundancy since during my journalism career. It's a far cry from Macquarie Bank, I'll tell you what, where I once worked. Look, Liz, I'd love to know your thoughts. I mean, I sometimes do get the impression that Conservatives don't even want to mention the existence of racism at all, especially because it has become a bit of a totem for the progressive left.
Yeah, well, it's very true. They have weaponised this. And so Conservatives now do get a bit of a bad rap in just being like, nothing to see here. But I was having a chuckle when Caleb was talking, because the truth of the matter is, as white people, we also can't come out and say, well, Australia's not racist and what are you guys talking about? We're really... We don't have the grounds to be able to do that. And I think part of the left's, the idea of giving minority groups in Australia a louder voice, because that's the whole PC movement, that's the whole victimhood gives you a bigger platform, that's how this whole currency works. That's where Conservatives have really got their backs up at this movement that keeps on insisting. We see it on the ABC all the time, that Australia is such a racist country and we need to do more and this and that, and patriotism is an ugly word and all the rest of it. And I think, I'm like Caleb, I'm not sure what their ultimate goal is in
Look,
pushing that agenda.
I think there is a genuine concern. I do think that there is a genuine concern on their part. They honestly do believe that calling attention to the issue, portraying these minorities as victims, is because they do see us as victims that need to be helped. And whether you consider that patronising or not, I do think at least some of them are doing so with good intentions. Sure, some might be treating us as political footballs. I'd certainly love to know. I mean, coming from Advance Australia, I mean, is it a priority for you, for example, to look at Australians who are of non-white backgrounds, who are patriotic and who have come to this country to feature more prominently for you, I wonder?
Yeah, absolutely. I no longer work for Advance Australia, but while I did, and I know for a fact even now, like we have a massive, it's over 100,000 members now that Advance Australia has. And those are people from all different walks of life. Australia is, as we know, a massively multicultural nation. And so we have people from all over the world who now call Australia home that love that movement because it's just standing for mainstream Australian values. And that is something that people of all different races and creeds can ascribe to and get behind.
Okay. Now, Justin, I'd love to hear from you, and notwithstanding what Liz said, I definitely give you my permission as a white person to comment on racism.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I've got carte blanche. Mate, I've got to say I loved what you said. I would say, though, there is racism in every country in the world. And yes, there is racism here in Australia. And some of it is pretty bad. It's pretty awful. A lot of it is on the internet, obviously, on social media. And that's kind of where the worst of humanity sort of tends to go to spew out their bile on everyone. But I really like what you said, because I think talking about positive stories and talking about what the Chinese Australian community is doing, good positive stories about them is terrific. As we know in the media, good positive stories don't always tend to find their way on the front page, but I think we've still got to tell them. But I also think ignoring the fact that there is racism in Australia isn't going to help, because it's certainly there.
Yeah,
you know, whether you're going to see it every day. Oh yeah, there's a nuance, and some of it is absolutely blatant. I don't think Australia is a particularly racist country. It's just that we've got racism in it, and if we get the chance to call it out, I think we've got to do it. And as a white person who doesn't get subjected to it, apart from the odd Irish joke that I hear now and then, for me, I think we've got to call it out every chance we get.